Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Billi FitzSimons.
I'm Emma Gillespie.
A group of world leaders spoke out this week against the Israeli government's aid distribution model in Gaza, including IDF soldiers killing Palestinians trying to get food and supplies. It comes almost 2 years into Israel's bombardment of Gaza and repeated limitation of aid following Hamas's attack on Israel in October 2023. In today's episode, we'll explain what we know about the Israeli army's killing of Palestinians accessing aid from United Nations staff on the ground in Gaza and the global response.
Billi, so much has happened in terms of the humanitarian situation in Gaza, the delivery of aid to Palestinian people in recent weeks. But before we get into the most recent happenings, the deaths, the killing of people accessing aid, can you share what we know about the humanitarian crisis in the region as a whole? Can you just paint a bit of a picture of what's gone on in the last nearly 2 years?
Yeah, so most of what we know about this comes from the United Nations themselves because they have volunteers and workers there on the ground. And so you'll see that we heavily rely on them in our reporting today.
I think it's also worth mentioning that journalists are not actually allowed in Gaza. There is no reporting from the ground, which is why we have to rely on bodies like the United Nations for resources when it comes to updates.
Yeah, exactly. Now, in terms of what we know, so there are about 2.1 million people who live in Gaza. The World Food Programme, which is a United Nations agency, they estimate that this entire population is facing, at a minimum, crisis levels of food insecurity. So no one is better off than that. Everyone is at that crisis level or worse. They also said that almost 100,000 women and children are suffering from severe acute malnutrition, and many people are dying from this lack of humanitarian assistance every single day.
And when we talk about humanitarian assistance, of course, there is the food insecurity conversation. A lot of what we'll talk about today is about food aid, but aid includes a whole raft of supplies for everyday life, the basics, the fundamentals, and a lot of that is medicine, healthcare, those kinds of things.
Exactly.
Nappies, baby food, formula.
Yeah, and the latest update from the UN said that fuel availability is also critically low, threatening the shutdown of hospitals and ambulances. The other thing the UN has said is that prices for basic commodities have increased by around 4,000%.
Yeah, I heard this from someone interviewed in Gaza this week describing how the cost of flour had surged and how it's so expensive to buy a simple bag of flour to make bread.
Yes.
And that even something like that is so unaffordable for the everyday person in Gaza where people there don't work because they're in a war zone.
Yeah, exactly. I think I must have read the same thing as you, and it was like a bag of flour is something like $200. And the UN said this week for Gaza's inhabitants who have lost their homes and been displaced multiple times, they have no income and find themselves completely deprived of essentials. On Tuesday, a spokesperson for the UN Secretary General said the population in Gaza remains gravely undersupplied with the basic necessities of life. Israel has the obligation to allow and facilitate, by all the means at its disposal, the humanitarian relief provided by the United Nations and by other humanitarian organisations.
Okay, so Billi, we know there are organisations, agencies, the United Nations among them trying to help, trying to deliver this critical aid that is needed in Gaza. How does that happen?
So after a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas broke down earlier this year, Israel instituted an aid blockade to Gaza. Then Israeli PM Benjamin Netanyahu partially lifted the blockade in May. That was following international criticism. Now, aid is currently largely distributed by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is a non-government organisation with US and Israeli support. It has 4 sites set up in Gaza, and the model has been extensively criticised by the UN and also by other countries, which I'll get to in more detail later. But one of the reasons it has been criticised is because of Israeli troops' repeated killings of Palestinians trying to access aid.
Part of the reason that this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, the GHF, has been so controversial, among many reasons, is that the 4 sites set up in Gaza, for many residents, that requires them to travel great distances. It further restricts access to aid if we're talking about a population of people who are critically ill or starving or can't access medical support or cannot walk those distances. Then that's another layer of kind of food insecurity and complexity in the rollout of the GHF.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so a very complicated picture that you've painted there, Billi, particularly over the last few months. What has happened in the last week? I know there were some major headlines over the weekend in particular. What's the latest?
So on Sunday, the World Food Programme, which, like I said before, is a United Nations-run agency, they were trying to deliver aid to Palestinians in northern Gaza, who they said were in desperate need of food supplies, which, as I just laid out, is exactly what we know to be true. Now, they said that after crossing a final border checkpoint, the convoy encountered large crowds of civilians. And their statement then said, as the convoy approached, the surrounding crowd came under fire from Israeli tanks, snipers, and other gunfire, resulting in a large number of casualties. According to the Associated Press, who was quoting the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry, Israeli forces killed at least 79 Palestinians in the incident, and an additional 6 people were also reportedly killed trying to access aid near Rafah in southern Gaza, and that was according also to officials speaking to the Associated Press. Those figures haven't been independently verified for reasons that we talked about before. And we know that the World Food Programme has now paused convoy movement through that crossing where these killings by the Israeli troops occurred because it is too dangerous.
Okay, so a total of 85 reported deaths in one day, all civilians trying to access aid. How did Israel respond to those killings?
So Israel's foreign ministry said the Israeli Defense Forces troops did indeed fire warning shots, which they claimed was to remove an immediate threat from the crowds. They didn't exactly share what that immediate threat was, but they said there was an immediate threat. They also questioned the number of casualties being reported. So they said the details of the incident are still being examined, but that an initial review suggests the number of casualties reported does not align with the information held by the IDF.
Okay, so we know that access to aid has been a concern in Gaza since October 2023, but it's really become much more of a critical concern in the last 6 months especially. Do we know how many Palestinians have died from this violence while trying to access aid?
Yeah, so on Tuesday, the United Nations put out a statement telling us exactly that. So they said that now more than 1,000 Palestinians have been killed by the Israeli military while trying to get food in Gaza. And they said that that number comes from multiple reliable sources on the ground, including medical teams, humanitarian and human rights organisations.
Okay, I want to zoom out a little bit and talk about the international community now, Billi, as well, because there has been mounting pressure, escalating attention on Gaza, pressure on the Israeli government, and a statement this week from nearly 30 countries essentially demanding for the war in Gaza to end. What has happened since we got that statement?
Yeah, so like you said, we got this statement from foreign ministers from about 30 countries, including Australia's Foreign Minister, Penny Wong. I'll read out some of what they said. So they said, the suffering of civilians in Gaza has reached new depths. The Israeli government's aid delivery model is dangerous, fuels instability, and deprives Gazans of human dignity. We condemn the drip feeding of aid and the inhumane killing of civilians, including children, seeking to meet their most basic needs of water and food.
That was a statement that was co-signed by Australia's foreign minister, as well as ministers from countries like the UK, Canada, Japan, several countries all over Europe, 28 in total.
Yes, exactly. And one thing I will mention is that the Israeli government has said that the model is needed to divert aid from Hamas. So there have been concerns that aid would be getting into the wrong hands, being Hamas.
So the argument from Israeli authorities being that Hamas, a terrorist organization, exists on the ground in Gaza and it is trying to deprive the terrorist organization of accessing aid.
And the statement also acknowledged the hostages that were taken by Hamas on October 7, 2023. So according to the United Nations, as of last week, it is estimated that 50 Israelis and foreign nationals remain captive in Gaza, including some of whom have died. And in this statement, the foreign ministers called for the immediate and unconditional release of the hostages, which they've been doing throughout the nearly 2 years of this war. So there's no change there. But overall, this statement's main message was that the war in Gaza must end now. And that's a direct quote from the statement.
When we get statements like this, I suppose there's a bit of reinvigorated conversation in the global community about ceasefire talks, where they're up to, where they're at. Is there any update on a ceasefire?
I mean, the update is that there really isn't that much of an update. Negotiations have stalled, and that's as much as we really know.
Billi, thank you so much for taking us through that. Obviously, we, want to be able to give our listeners the latest and a bit more on this situation. But as you explained with the ceasefire negotiations, there isn't that information that we can really share, but we will stay across it. It certainly seems like the international community, humanitarian groups are not looking away from the dispute over aid distribution, the concerns over humanitarian aid in Gaza. We'll continue to keep a close eye on that and bring you guys updates as we hear them.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. We will be back a little later on today with the evening headlines, but until then, have a good day.